back here with you guys. It's been a minute, and I wish we could make the trip more often, but the more kids we have, the harder the trip gets. So yeah, excited to share more of my trip to Israel. I got to share this presentation with the church over in Ogden, where I get to preach for on Sundays. And when I did this over in Ogden, it was 3 sermons and 3 Bible classes, and I got to figure out a way to condense that down into 1 sermon and 3 Bible classes. So I got to figure out a way to cut 2 lessons and combine them. So bear with me. I'm going to try to not go too long over our time, but I'm not going to make any promises. So just a little bit of background. I want to follow in the tradition of the Apostle Paul, and from Romans chapter 1, verse 7, first, I think it's the most important thing that we can do in our lives is give thanks for the blessings and give thanks for when people bless us. And so if you'll notice, I've got some logos up here that really need a lot of thanks. So we've got more discipleship missions. They are the ones that helped organize this entire trip. So we were in Israel. So it was a 13-day trip. It was 11 full days in country. We're very busy. And more discipleship missions, they organized the whole thing. From the time I got to the airport to the time I got back to the airport. Every meal, every hotel stay, every site that we went to, it was all done through them. And just through their generosity, they footed the bill for students, for grad students. It's a trip that would normally cost. You can go to their website and you can sign up to do what I did. And they've got other trips to different parts of the Bible lands. They've got a trip they're advertising right now to go see the 7 churches of Asia, fall of 2024. And these trips usually cost $3,000 to $4,000 per person. But they said, hey, God has blessed us richly, and so part of the way that we give back is we want to be able to take Bible students to go see this. And so huge thanks to them. And then they did it through Freed-Hardeman University, where I'm getting my Master of Divinity, so that we could get course credit for it. And so it's kind of a win-win. I get to see a lot of cool places, but I also get course credit. So that's 1 less class I have to take this fall, which gives me a little bit more time to change diapers. Lastly, the Associates for Biblical Research. If you want to know more about biblical archaeology and know more about how archaeology has done nothing but prove the Bible to be historically accurate, this is going to be your go-to resource, Associates for Biblical Research. It is a very large archaeological organization that when they approach the land, right, in Israel, in other places where they have dug, they use the Bible as their map. And they say, well, the Bible says this should be here, so we're going to break out the pickaxe and we're going to dig here. And they are one of the only archaeological organizations that does it that way. Most archaeology today is done by secular scientists who will just dig wherever, I guess, strikes their fancy. I don't know how they determine it. But ABR, we were there in Israel supporting ABR. So the primary reason for our trip was to do excavations at Shiloh. And that excavation was being led by the Associates for Biblical Research. And so nothing but good things to say about them. They're not denominationally affiliated that I know of. They're just archaeologists. And so as far as the trip itself, so over the course of the 11 days, I got to see 30 different locations and learn about not only their biblical significance, but also their archaeological significance. What research has been done at these sites to prove that, hey, the Bible's right here. And so I'm going to do my best to try to hit all of those places over the next few lessons. And so it was a life-changing experience, and I'm so glad I took it. And hey, I'm very prayerful that maybe one day I'll get to do it again, but it'll probably have to be when the kids are a little bit older. But so you guys get a feel for it, my flow for today and through Wednesday. So for our Bible class this morning, I'm just going to give like a big picture overview of archaeology in general.
Kind of like that. Would that help?
Yes. What's that?
Got that.
Oh, yeah. Hit the lights right there. Yeah, so...
Is that going to bother you?
No, not at all. We actually had these off last night, so it did look a lot better. Thank you. Yeah, a lot better. So I'm going to do a big picture overview of archaeology, and then I'm going to talk about Shiloh, where we were digging and spent 5 of our 11 days. And then for the sermon hour, that might be like closer to 11, we'll see. I'm going to talk about my favorite quote-unquote Jesus places. We went to so many places in Jerusalem and did the whole walk where Jesus walked, but I'm going to try to share just 3 or 4 of my favorite ones. For this evening, is when I'm going to really open up my travel journal, and I'm going to start knocking out all these 30 places we went through, and we'll just go as far as we can for as long as time allows, and then on Wednesday evening, I'll pick up where we left off, and we'll finish it. So hopefully that won't be a preaching till midnight on Wednesday, but I'll be here as long as you guys keep wanting to see more pictures. I'll keep sharing them. I took over 1,000 pictures, so to give a little bit of a background, why did it skip? On biblical archaeology. Okay, so biblical archaeology is hugely significant because when secular historians and Bible critical historians approach history, they're not looking to the Bible for answers. They're looking at the ground first. Okay, and so I want to give just this quick example of how archaeology has helped us prove that the Bible can be and is historically accurate. And so there's this thing known as the Exodus controversy. And I'm using this as an example. So there's the late date Exodus. That has been favored by critical scholars and historians for most of recent history. And according to the late date Exodus view, the Exodus event did happen in some capacity. There's debate over how many Israelites were in Egypt, but there is general agreement that some form of an Exodus event did happen, but it most likely happened in 1270 BC. 1270 BC. And they say, this is why I have this graphic up here, because the reasoning is, well, that's what the ground says. That's what archaeology says. When we just look at the evidence that we're finding, that we're digging up, when we look at the structures, when we look at the memorabilia and the artifacts, what we're finding is evidence of an Exodus-type event happening in 1270 BC. Well, there's a big problem with that, because if you follow a strict and literal biblical timeline, that's given in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it gives us the time from Solomon back to Moses. And it spells it out explicitly. 480 years before Solomon was the Exodus event. And historians, Christian or non-Christian alike, are very settled on the date that Solomon began building his temple in 966 BC. Like there's enough evidence that's locked in. There's no dispute there, right? So what do we do with this? The Bible says that the Exodus happened 480 years before Solomon, which would place the Exodus at 1446, but yet when we look at the ground says 1270. What are we going to do here? Some biblical scholars, they try to blend the two, and they try to play fast and loose with the biblical text, and they say, well, this doesn't disprove the Bible, because if we interpret this passage this way, and change these names this way, and we make many of the events in the book of Judges happen all at the same time, then we could kind of fit the biblical timeline into this late date view. But most conservative biblical scholars and people like us who just want to take the Bible as it is, we get a little apprehensive when we start playing fast and loose with the Bible. Why should we interpret something symbolically when it gives a very clear explanation? So this is where groups like ABR come into play. When they just open their Bibles and say, well, this is what the Bible says, let's start digging here. And so, as more and more research has been done over the past roughly 10 to 20 years, they have found significantly more evidence in the ground that, sure enough, the Exodus very likely did happen exactly as the Bible described it. And this evidence is based on, again, finding things like Israel-specific memorabilia in the right places, sacrificial animals in the right places, Egyptian artifacts in the right places. I'm not going to get into all that. I'm not trying to prove to you the date. I'm bringing this up to say that as more and more archaeology is done, all it is doing is confirming the Bible more and more, not disproving it. So just as there's this mindset in the world today that you either believe science or you believe the Bible, but yet any of us who have studied it even just a little bit, and folks like good old Dave Everson who kind of specializes in this stuff, if science has only proven the Bible to be accurate, it's never disproven God. Well, archaeology is the same way. It has always supported the biblical account. And so with that said, let's get into some big picture details of what biblical archaeology looks like. And so, number one, archaeology is slow and expensive. I know this is hard to read over here, so I'm going to briefly explain this as I go. But archaeology is extremely slow and extremely expensive. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. You see, archaeology in the Bible lands didn't really take off until about the 1800s, and then there was a stopgap, and then it didn't resume until the mid to late 1900s. And so the number one reason is political. political unrest in Israel, throughout the Middle East. Keep in mind that the Middle East, Israel, has had political unrest almost constantly since Solomon's son Rehoboam in 900 BC. So we're going back almost 3,000 years where Israel has been in constant conflict to some degree or another. We've got the Roman Empire, and then Rome became a Christian empire, and then the Muslims came in and established the Ottoman Empire, and so the Ottoman Empire was from 1299 to World War I, 1923. So for well over 1,000 years, 1,700 years, there was Islamic control in the area. They don't want biblical archaeology to go on there, right? And so then fast forward, you got World War II, Britain takes over, and then we give Israel back to the Jews, but there's still not peace, so they have to fight the Six-Day War in 1967. But it's not until 1979 that they sign a peace treaty, and so it's not until the 1980s that biblical archaeology can really resume. And all that to say, you can't dig in places where there's constantly gunfire going on overhead, right? And so this is why today there's so much archaeology going on that couldn't have been done 100 years ago. Another reason is weather. You can't dig when it's not safe. And so if it's if it's too hot, if it's too cold, if it's too windy, if it's too rainy, so that eliminates most of the year. and so you've only got a small window each year in which they can actually safely and thoroughly conduct excavations. Another reason is simply manpower. When you're doing archaeology, you can't use power equipment, right? Because if you bring in a large excavator because you're wanting to clear this mountaintop and find what's underneath it, you're going to lose so much history by using that excavator. You could be toppling entire buildings, you could be smashing pottery, you could be losing the greatest find that there's ever been by doing this. So everything has to be done by hand. And when we were in our dig square in Shiloh, our rule, I don't know if this is normative, but at least for where we were digging, our rule was we only go 3 inches at a time. So we've got a pickaxe and some tiny like little gardening spades, and we're stripping the earth about 3 inches at a time. And so it's a very slow process, but we do this so that we don't miss anything. And then another reason it's slow, so manpower, equipment, and then financial. Digging is really, really expensive. It costs millions of dollars per location over the course of years. Each season, so they refer to each year that a place has been excavated is referred to as a season. So at Shiloh, they're on season 5. And so if you go on ABR's Facebook page, I've shared some of their posts before, they'll refer to season 5 Shiloh. Well, that means the 5th year of their excavations, right? And so each season can cost anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars because they have to replace all of their equipment. They have to pay for lodging. They have to pay for travel. They have to pay the Israeli government rights to dig. So they're basically leasing the land from the Israeli government. And all this adds up fast. Plus the full-time staff that's there, I mean, they got to put food on their tables too, so they need to have some form of an income as well. And so it is extremely expensive. For a standard volunteer, because the majority of the workforce over there is volunteer-based. So they had, I don't remember exactly how many full-time staff they had. I want to say it was under 10, but I could be wrong on that. But we had about 100 volunteers. So Freed-Hardeman, we had a team of 10. There was about 100 volunteers just the week we were there. We were there for 1 week. The dig season lasts for 5 weeks. Okay, so you're looking at, if there's an average of 100 each week, 500 volunteers, each volunteer has to pay $400 to $500 to be able to go dig and help them. So you're actually paying money to volunteer, and not many people really want to do that. And so it's incredibly expensive. And so how does that little bit of background on why archaeology is so slow and why we're just now finding all this great stuff? Let's apply that to Shiloh real quick, and then I'll actually get into Shiloh. So Shiloh was first discovered in 1838 by an American expedition team, but they didn't do any thorough quality excavations. So it's another 100 years, 1922 to 1932, before there's any actual excavations that's going on. And the lead archaeologist for that died unexpectedly of a sickness in 1932. And at that time, the way that digging worked was the Israeli Well, it wasn't Israel at that time, so I'm not exactly sure legally how they got the rights to do it. So it probably would have been written. But anyway, the rights to dig was given to the director of the dig site. So if the director all of a sudden dies, well, guess what? Nobody's allowed to dig now. And that's not the way it works today, because now we have organizations and they can replace people. All right. So after he died, nobody dug there for another 50 years. A lot of it's because of political unrest. So it's not until the 1980s that the recent excavations resumed again, and they're still digging today. Here we are in 2023. So 50 to 40 years of active digging. That's not been every single year. And so what have they found over that time period? Well, the biggest one, and I'm going to get to some pictures of this, but the biggest find they've had there in recent digs was actually made last year, and they discovered the tabernacle of Joshua. And so I'm going to get into that biblical history as we go forward a little bit, but that was a huge, huge find. And so let's talk about, you can see this was a rough draft slide, you know. Here's where I'm going to talk about this. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of biblical context so that you can kind of appreciate where we're digging and what we're finding and the significance of that. So Shiloh from a biblical context. So I'm going to take the Bible to be true and historically accurate, and if we're going to do that, that place is Exodus at 1446 BC. All dates here are in BC. Okay, and then over here on the right-hand side, I've got the books of the Bible that were written during that each time period, so you can just kind of get a feel for when you open your Bibles, you know, roughly the time period we're talking about. And so we have the Exodus, 1446, so add 40 years for wandering in the desert, because the Israelites messed up pretty much immediately. It's the story of their lives. And so in 1406 is when they actually cross the Jordan River, and the first city they conquer is Jericho. That's one of the most famous Bible stories because there's a song and the walls come tumbling down, right? And so roughly, this is not to scale. This was just me on Google Earth doing a quick pin drop just for visual sake. But so we're going from Egypt, from the Nile Delta in northern Egypt, and they would have went down south. They crossed the Red Sea. We don't know exactly where. There's a lot of theories. I'm not read up enough to know. But there's a lot of theories. But anyway, they crossed the Red Sea, which is through here, and then they followed this peninsula down, staying in the valley because it's hard to climb mountains. And they followed the valley all the way up. This is the Dead Sea. So over here they're in, if I remember correctly, this is Amorite territory over here. And right here is the Jordan River. They cross the Jordan, they conquer Jericho, and that begins the conquest of Joshua. The whole conquest lasts about 6 years. It takes them 6 years to conquer all of Canaan's land, which would be this territory here. As far north as Sidon, which is in present-day Lebanon. So you can see it's a good, I'm going to ballpark and spit this at about 50 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. I could be off on that. But it goes pretty far north, all the way down below the Dead Sea. So we got this huge area. And so just for point of reference, we have Jericho in the Jordan. We have Jerusalem just a little to the west of that. We have Shiloh just a little bit to the north of Jericho, just as a point of reference. And so at Shiloh, what's going on is after the conquest is complete, they take over the land. The Israelites make their capital in Shiloh. That is where they establish their Washington, D.C. Okay? That's where they establish their Jerusalem in the time period. This is their temple. And so in 1400 B.C., you have, this is the book of Joshua, and in Joshua 18, you have God apportioning the land to the tribes, to the 12 tribes. So they cast the lots. God providentially manipulates the lots so that each territory gets where God intended them to go. And that happens in 1400. That happens right there in Shiloh where they do that. And Joshua builds a tabernacle. That is the temple for where God would reside. That's where the Ark of the Covenant would rest. And that the Ark of the Covenant stayed in the tabernacle there longer than anywhere else in its history. It stayed there for over 300 years. And during that time period, you have all the events of the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. And then coming to the end of Shiloh, approximately 1050 BC, the Philistines destroy Shiloh. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly when, and we just haven't found enough evidence yet to get a good date. But it would be approximately 1050 BC. The Philistines destroyed it. That's the same time that Saul is being appointed as king. That's the time of Samuel. Samuel was raised in Shiloh. Shiloh was the tabernacle where the priest Eli was that Hannah prayed. And so we're going to see that, I believe. Here's another slide for the conquest. I'm sorry, I should have had this up when I was talking about it. I know there's a lot on this. You don't have to worry about this. There's no pop quiz. I just threw this up here because it shows the battle route. So they come up to the Dead Sea, they conquer Jericho, they take over the middle territory first, and then they move south, and then move all the way north, and then they go back to Shiloh. I don't know who Joshua was taking directions from. That's probably not the way I would have done it. Well, I guess if that's the way God instructed, maybe I would have. So I'll take that back. So here it is on the bigger map. Shiloh's at that star, okay? So key events in Shiloh, I've already kind of talked about these. Joshua 18, the land is allotted to the tribes. So here's the apportioning of the tribes, okay? And so I'm gonna plant this seed now because I'm gonna pick it up probably on Wednesday. So help me remember to water this seed, okay? So Dan is given the land down here according to Joshua 18, okay? But yet there's a city of Dan way, way up north here. And that's really significant, but I'll talk about that later. Okay? So, land is a portion. The tabernacle is here in Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant is there. 1 Samuel. We have the account of Hannah, and she's praying because she can't have a child. And so the priest Eli hears her praying. He thinks she's drunk because she's hysterically praying. She wants a child, and she's praying, God, if you give me a child, that child will be yours. I'll give you my child. And so after Samuel is weaned, Hannah takes Samuel to be raised by the priest there in the tabernacle. So that's what's going on in Shiloh. That's why it's so biblically significant. Samuel being the prophet who was the advisor to King Saul and then to King David. So let's get some pictures now. Now that I've talked enough history and bored everyone to death, let's get into some pictures. So here we are today. This is a picture I took. And so there's a museum up top here, on top of they call them a tell. So tell is just like a hilltop. And so this is called Tel Shiloh, or as they say it over there, they pronounce it Tel Shiloh. And so here I am kind of at the ground level, and as you go up the face, it's all uphill, and you can kind of see these stone walls. So all these are different buildings that are on the Tel and throughout Shiloh, each building of different degree of significance. And so I'll share another picture here in just a moment. But the museum here was really fascinating because when you walk in, it's got like a little movie theater, and it's got like this big wraparound timeline that explains all of the archaeological history that I don't have time to go into today, but it was really neat and beautiful. But here's a little bit better picture. I got to take this with my drone, and so flying a drone in Israel is not typically a smart idea, but I had to make sure I jumped through all the right hoops and loops to get cleared by the Israeli government to be allowed to fly my drone. So I was able to get this aerial snapshot of the area. And so just to give you a lit perspective of the size of what we're going for here, again, we've got 100 volunteers digging around this area, and there's actually more excavations just around the hillside here. But this just gives you a perspective on the size. So here's our little people that look like ants, very large area. And let's see. So what I want to do when I talk about Shiloh, I'm going to talk about the hierarchy of how the dig process works, our squares, the tools that we use, what our daily routine look like. So when we're digging, the way that the hierarchy works is that we've got a director of the dig site, and he's the boss, right? So if you're in the military, like he's the commanding officer who's in charge of making sure all the peons do their job, okay? And so he's got an assistant director, and then we have what's known as squares. And so squares are basically a designated dig site. You can kind of see them here, but they're just houses, they're just rooms, they're just buildings. Each team would be assigned one of these. But then we have some specialists that are there. So we had, I don't remember her name, I never actually got to meet her face to face, but we had there on the staff the world's #1 leading expert in pottery. And I don't know what it takes to be a pottery expert, but from what I understand, it's like a 20-year degree program. Like, it's insane. The amount of time and expertise it takes to learn this. And it was amazing because I did kind of get to eavesdrop and hear her work a little bit. And if you brought her a piece of pottery, as long as it was of substantial size or had a design on it, like a curvature, an etching mark, she could take that, she could look at it, and she could date that to within about 100 years. I mean, she's just that adept at seeing every little finite grain detail in a piece of pottery and tell you what time period it came from based on that. We also had a zooarchaeologist, which is a really fancy term for somebody who specializes in bones. And so the bone specialist was pretty critical because he was able to help us identify in some of the bone piles that groups were finding. He's able to look at the type of cut marks and the type of burn marks that are on these bones and say, these were sacrificial animals. Like, this wasn't like Tuesday's dinner. This was being offered up to God. And so he was a critical role. We had a metal detector, we had translators, and we had a carpenter who helped build a lot of the structures that we see that gives us shade. He helped build a lot of the sifters that I have pictures for, so he played a critical role as well. All right, so here's another drone picture. I didn't label this. Actually, I had a friend of mine that labeled this. He had a drone too, so this was his drone shot. But to give you a walkthrough, so this is just a straight down view of this for perspective, okay? And so this is the most significant finding right here, is the tabernacle. So this was where the priests were, this is where Eli was, this is where Samuel was raised, and right here is the Holy of Holies. So right here is where the Ark of the Covenant would have been resting for some 300 years. And so how do they know? How do they know that's a tabernacle? Because it's just a heap of rubble, it's just a heap of rock, right? Well, so what I learned about archaeology is archaeology itself is like learning a foreign language, because it's all about pattern recognition, right? So I was making the analogy, it's kind of like deer hunting, okay? So if you are an experienced deer hunter and you're with somebody who's never been hunting before, you can both be looking out at the same wood line, and the non-experienced hunter is going to be like, there's no deer out there, I don't see a thing. But then the experienced hunter, he's going to be like, what are you talking about? There's 30 deer standing right there. How do you not see them? Right? It's pattern recognition. Their eyes have just been trained to recognize certain changes in what they're viewing, and so they can say, well, this is a building versus this is just a heap of rock. Okay? And so when they uncovered this structure that they originally believed was the tabernacle, at the time that they found it, they believed the tabernacle should have been down here. This is where they were looking for it, but they couldn't find it. So they start digging elsewhere, and I think that there was a little bit of God's providence in play here. And the reason I say I think God might have been at play here is because they built this museum before they knew where the tabernacle was. And it's right here. Look how close that is. So if they had just built a little bit further to the north, just a little bit lower on that hilltop, they could have potentially demolished the tabernacle, the most significant finding in this entire area. And so I think God's hand was at play here a little bit, so that it wasn't destroyed when they were putting this museum up. But how else do they know it's the tabernacle, right? So they discovered the structure, and that they found it at the end of last year. And so another team, we weren't up there. They had their all-star team. They didn't have like their first-time diggers from Freed-Hardeman. This was like their experts, right, that know what they're doing up in the tabernacle. So they were digging it out more this year, but what they found is it matches the dimensions perfectly to the biblical description. It has the chambered room where there would be a Holy of Holies. More than that, they found the burn pile of the bones for sacrificial offerings. They found what's called a murex seashell. The reason I don't have pictures of some of the artifacts I'm going to mention is we're not allowed to take pictures over there. There's a whole lot of reasons for that I'm not going to get into, but that's why I don't have pictures of them for you. They found this seashell that was used to make the color blue. And so only priests were allowed to have blue garments. And so if you find this seashell that's not native to the land, it comes from the Mediterranean, some 60 miles to the west, this seashell that makes the color blue, they find it in this building that's believed to be the tabernacle. Well, things start adding up. They also found a ceramic pomegranate. And so it's about this large. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it just looks like a rock. But to the trained eye, they're like, no, that is a ceramic, that's a pottery pomegranate. And that is significant because only the priests were allowed to have these pomegranates. And what they would do is they would put them on their garments, and it was the only emblem of a fruit that was allowed in the tabernacle. It's the only one. And so the pomegranate was designated by God as a symbol of fertility for the nation of Israel. And so they find a pomegranate that only the priest can have. They find a seashell that makes the color blue that only the priest can have. They find sacrificial animal bones where only the priest would be offering sacrifices. They find the building that is of the exact dimensions that the Bible describes. You get enough dots here, and you're like, this is the tabernacle. This is it. This is where Samuel was raised, right? This is where Hannah was praying. That's it. So it was a huge, huge find for them to have that. Now, a couple other things. Here's the city wall. So this would have been the outer wall. What's really fascinating about this outer wall is that it predates the Israelites. It's older than the Israelite occupation of 1400. And so I didn't hear anybody proposing an exact date, but it would not be unreasonable to say it could be as old as 2000 BC, like the time of Abraham. Now, we don't know for sure. I wasn't there. I didn't talk with enough experts to know, but it would be reasonable. And the reason I say that is because Shiloh is one of two cities that the Israelites did not have to conquer by force. When the Israelites came to Shiloh, the people that were already living there, they just allowed the Israelites to basically absorb them. They acclimated themselves to Israel. And so there's no destruction layer, there was no tearing down walls, anything. So these walls, potentially very, very old. But a significant finding along the wall is they found the city gate. Does anybody know a significant biblical event that happened at the city gate? Somebody died. The priest Eli. Right? So the priest Eli, who is Samuel's mentor, so his sons, they're not good dudes. Right? His sons continually mess up. They introduce sexual immorality into the tabernacle. I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I believe there was some idol worship done by his sons as well. And when the Israelites go to war with the Philistines, his sons, who were supposed to be being trained as priests, but they're doing all of this immoral things, and they're desecrating God's tabernacle, they go off to battle. And they think, hey, we've got a really good idea. We're going to take the Ark of the Covenant with us. And so, unbeknownst to their dad, Eli, who's the head priest at the time, they steal the Ark of the Covenant and they take it to battle. Well, God doesn't like it when you disobey him. God says the ark's supposed to be here, and then they moved it, so what happens? His sons die, the ark gets captured by the Philistines, and when Eli hears this news, he is sitting in the city gate, and he falls over dead from hearing the news. And now what's fascinating is, it wasn't the news that his sons died that caused his heart attack or whatever caused him to actually die. It was the news that the Ark of the Covenant had been lost. When he heard that the mercy seat of God had fallen into the hands of the enemies, that was too much for him to handle. And he died in this city gate where we were excavating, where we were digging. And so, where were we? Where was Freed-Hardeman? Okay. Watching my time. So, it can be hard for people to read this up here, but if you remember on my title slide, the caption of the picture was Tyler standing on Gladys the Gorgeous. So I'm going to explain what that is. So Gladys the Gorgeous Glossy, this is the square where we were digging. This was Freed-Hardeman's assigned location. And so on this map, it was down here, right in here. And the reason this was significant is because, I'll explain what Glossy is here in a minute, but no other archaeologist team has ever preserved a glossy. And so our director, Dr. Scott Stripling, when they found this glossy a couple of years ago, he said, hey, we want to preserve this because nobody saved one of these before. And so we need to be very careful with how we do this. And so we were the team this year that got slotted with, hey, you guys work on this. And so what is a glossy? So a glossy is a support structure for a city's outer wall, but it was designed in such a way to not only fortify it to be built taller, but to fortify it so that it would better resist siege weapons and being conquered. So a glossy is a sand-based ramp that's built outside of the wall. So you've got a city wall, and then they would take sand and pile it up and build a ramp. And you would think, well, aren't you going to lose some height of the wall? Yeah, a little bit. But what that's going to do is, one, reinforce the wall so it won't fall down as easily. But two, you can't get siege weapons. You can't charge it. You can't try to demolish the wall nearly as easily if you're having to have an army of troops marching through this deep sand. And so it would slow the opponents down as they're trying to climb over this sand so that your archers on top of the wall could just play sniper and start picking the people off. And then over time, that sand glossy, that rampart, would actually harden and become sandstone. And well, that doesn't sound good either. Well, if it hardens, they'll be able to climb it easier. No, because sandstone apparently is, I'm all learning this is all news to me. So sandstone is extremely slick. And so you went from having to climb through deep sand to now you're having to get on like ice skates as you're walking up this thing. And so that's what the glossy is. And our director, Dr. Scott Stripling, was so excited for our team to be able to do this because it wasn't something we could really mess up. Like we're out in the tabernacle trying to find these little ceramic things that are this big. He's having us uncover a huge part of a wall. But we did have to have some precision. So we had our square supervisor help guide us because To the untrained eye, I wasn't able to see it until Friday, until being there for 5 days and looking at this for 8 hours for 5 days, that I was finally able to really understand what they were talking about. So the only way to see it is a very, very slight change in color. Because you're going from your normal rocky terrain, bedrock, it's got kind of a dark, almost reddish tint, to when they hit the glossy, it's just a hint of yellow in it. There's just a little bit of yellow. And so when we hit that yellow, it's like, okay, we got to slow down because we don't want to tear up the glossy. We're trying to preserve this. It was a very slow process. And so we had a really good square supervisor that told us, like, okay, stop digging here because we're at the glossy. And so he made sure we didn't mess it up. But it was really cool. So what are some tools of the trade that we were using for archaeology? I've already mentioned a couple of these. So this was no shovels allowed, okay? Day one, somebody had a shovel. I don't know where it came from. We didn't bring shovels with us. But day one, somebody had a shovel, and the director was like, get that shovel out of here. Right? Because what a shovel's designed for? Digging down and deep, right? What do we not want to do? That. We want to be scraping just a couple inches at a time, right? And so the shovel that we used, I forget the name for it. It was called something like a Taurel, or I don't remember the name, but it was this 90-degree shovel that was really more for like raking. So it was kind of like a fat pickaxe. And then, we've got brushes and brooms and dustpans and all kinds of things this is a very slow, intricate process. So small tools. Over here, we've got dry sifting. I've got a better picture of that here in just a second. And so what our process looked like as we've got some of us in the hole digging, and then some of us are doing the rest of the steps. So step one is we dig. Step two is we dry sift. And so this is the Gucci dry sifter. This is where everybody wants to be working because it doesn't break your back. And then this is the dry sifters we had. So this is it's these big wooden pans. It's like panning for gold almost. You got these metal graded sifters, and so you dump. They're called a goofa. I didn't come up with that name, but it's recycled tire that got repurposed into buckets. And so we got these goofas that would hold a few gallons of dirt, and so we dump these goofas into these dry sifters. And then we just start playing some music and doing the hippie shakes here. And we got to get all the loose dirt out, and then we got to sift through the rock that remains, and we're trying to find artifacts. And so one of the coolest finds that we had in our square was somebody found a flint knife. And so that was pretty cool. So the joke I told him was like, hey, don't you know that was a circumcision knife? He's like, ah. It was just a joke. I doubt it actually was, but who knows, maybe. So dry sifting, we were finding some pottery shards. I found one piece of glass. But really the moneymaker is in wet sifting. How am I on time? Okay. So wet sifting is you sift it again, but you got a water hose over top. Okay? And so you're cleaning everything off. And so wet sifting is hugely important because it's so easy, even for an expert, even for somebody with a trained eye, you get something that's covered in dirt, especially something small like jewelry or beads or coins, it's going to look like a rock to everybody and anybody. And so our team here with Dr. Scott Stripling, the director, he's kind of like a spearhead for this movement. He says we are wet sifting 100% of everything. And the reason is because his team was the team that found the Mount Ebal curse tablet from a couple years ago. And so if you're not familiar with the Mount Ebal curse tablet, it is arguably the most significant find in probably the past 100 years in archaeology. Because this curse tablet that was found at Mount Ebal, what it did was it proved that the Israelites had a written language system at the time of Joshua, which was never believed before by critical scholars. Oh, the Israelites, they're just a bunch of stupid people. They don't have language, they don't have writing. So it's the oldest form of Hebrew script that's been found. It was found on the location of Mount Ebal, where it was the ceremony of curses and blessings, and we're told that God gave the Israelites a curse that they had to write on a tablet and put on this mountaintop. We're going to talk about that more at a later time, but it's the right place. They found a curse tablet with the right text. It has the biblical curse on it. And this thing is the size of a postage stamp. And it was found in a junk pile. A previous archaeologist from the late 80s, I believe, was at Mount Ebal, and he's looking for structures. He's not looking for little artifacts. And so he had this large dump pile that everything was going. He didn't wet sift. It was just a very quick dry sift. He didn't really care about small things. So Dr. Scott Stripling's team in 2019, they go to Mount Olive and say, hey, we want to wet sift. We want to clean some of what the previous team, Adams Zertal's team, did. That name just popped in my head. I don't know why. That is the correct name, but Adams Zertal's team in the 80s. And so they're wet sifting his junk pile. This is trash. This is, hey, we can get rid of this. It's worthless. They wet sift it. They hose everything off, and they find this curse tablet that has completely changed the paradigm of our understanding of history. And when I say our, I mean generally like secular history by finding this. And it was found because of wet sifting. So wet sifting is crazy important. If you would compare how many artifacts they found wet sifting versus how many were found dry sifting, I mean, it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. It's easier to see things when they're clean. And we're low on time, and that's okay because I've only got a couple of slides left, and these are really quick ones. So, big question, do you get to keep anything? The answer is, if it's junk, it can be your junk. Right? Now, I know that sounds funny because I just talked about how junk pile was found, the curse tablet, that was the biggest find ever. Well, this junk pile at Shiloh is sifted through and examined much more closely. And so the junk pile here, I mean, this is like 3 feet deep of pottery shards. This is huge junk pile. And everything here has been looked at by multiple layers of experts that have said, this piece of pottery does not help us with anything, it's trash. And so all of it has been touched, examined, and looked at, and if it's in that pile, you can keep it. So I got to keep a few pieces, but luggage is tight, and so I didn't get to keep as many as I was wanting to. So some of the key findings, this is one of our last slides. So things that we found while we were there, and when I say we now, I don't mean the FHU team, I mean just the week that we were there. So there were scarabs that were found, and these are significantly important because a scarab is a little stone beetle about yay big, and what has etched on the top of it would be the beetle. The bottom of it would be an inscription for whatever pharaoh was in power at that time. But here's the thing with scarabs. When there's a new pharaoh in town, what do you do with old scarabs? Trash them. Throw them away. Right? So if you find a scarab, that gives you a really, really good idea of exactly the time period you're looking at, because it tells you what pharaoh was in power. And so we found some scarabs, lots and lots of pottery, some stamping seals called bullas. So I mean, we have our rubber stamps today, so they would have ceramic and stone stamps that would be for quick inscripting things. Found coins, sacrificial animals, seashell, pomegranate. Found some weapons. It was more than just the one flint knife that our team did find. Found some throwing stones, and they knew it was throwing stones because, I mean, it looked like a bowling ball, a small bowling ball, but like this was intentionally carved and rounded and manipulated. Some jewelry, some glass, and of course, gorgeous Gladys the Gorgeous glacis. And with that, so here's a better picture of the glacis. It looks kind of yellow. I don't know if you guys can really see the yellow tone in it. But so this whole area is where we were digging, and so here you can see the slope of it, and this would be extremely slick, so it's very difficult to climb up. And so yeah, that is my last slide for now, and so I'll pick up and talk about some Jesus stuff during the sermon hour. So thanks for your time and attention. I only went 10 minutes late, so don't hold that against me.